Welcome. My name is Emily Loeb, and I'm the Director of Programs and Education at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. For those of you who are new to our organization, we teach about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with the goal of building a more civil and humane society today. And we run a host of programs to accomplish this, like the one you're at tonight. And I want to note before we get started that April is Genocide Awareness Month, and the year 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. And several of our recent and upcoming programs are going to focus specifically on liberation. And tonight's program is just one of the many programs that we have planned in the coming months. A couple of specific events that I want to call to your attention include Thursday, April 24th at 7 p.m. at Road of Shalom is our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration, where we will remember the victims of the Holocaust and the survivors who moved here to Pittsburgh. In addition to a candlelighting ceremony and a memorial service, there will be music performed by students who are part of the Pittsburgh Youth Symphony Orchestra. Art and poetry from the Waltham Arts and Writing Competition will be on display. And then on Wednesday, June 24th at 6:30 here at Chatham, we will be screening a short film produced by educators at PA Cyber, featuring the story of local Holocaust survivor Melvin Goldman and his daughter, who is here, Lee Keichel, you can raise your hand, will be joining us to talk about the film along with the filmmaker Scott Rutledge. And we hope you'll come for that event. Again, that's going to be in celebration of the end of the war and recognition of that. We have many more programs and events lined up, so please feel free to refer to our events page on our website. And finally, I want to thank the Sylvia and Martin Snow Family Fund, who generously support our Generations program and help make tonight's event possible. So before I turn the program over, I want to briefly explain how this evening came to be. So this past fall, Hedda came to our office explaining that she was in the process of writing her family's story, and that she eventually wanted to offer to the Holocaust Center and wanted to know if we knew anyone who could help her translate some Yiddish that was written on the back of some family photographs. And then she started talking about her family story. And we were captivated instantly and asked if she was willing to potentially share her family story in an event like tonight. And I have to say, I've heard a lot of Holocaust survivors' stories, and this one is one of the ones that gave me chills. And so I promised Hedda I wouldn't spoil it, but I'm really excited that you're here tonight to get to hear it for yourselves. And now I'd like to call up our friend Bill Eisler, who has known and worked with Hedda for decades, to introduce her.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks for all the work you do. There are many words I could use to describe Hedda. Mother, daughter, grandmother, friend, professional, a marvelous, marvelous public speaker. In fact, anytime anybody would call our house and there was an early childhood conference and wanted to know who they should get to speak, my wife Marty would absolutely say, Hedda Sharapan, here's the number. She's a marvelous speaker. Hedda and I met and we were going over this, and I always say that as one ages, dates really don't mean anything, so we don't always agree on the same date. But I think it was 1973 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Hedda was speaking at an early childhood conference, and I was working in the Mon Valley running a child development program. And a couple weeks after that I met Hedda, I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, and I said, you know, we have a speaking series for parents in the community about young children, and I'd really like to bring some people out. Do you have any recommendations? And Steve right away said, Hedda Sharapan. I was in school with her. She's really fabulous. I said, I just met her. Now, what was wonderful, they were the days without GPS, and you'd ask people to come to the door, Vanessa, Monongahela, and they'd say, where's that? But Hedda was great. I said, we're going to do it in Denora. Is that okay? She said, I have a great friend in Denora. I can get to Denora. So not only did Hedda speak there that night, but many other nights. But that night, her speech was, is television chewing gum for the eyes? Now, that's a whole other subject. But Hedda's life has been involved with young children. Hedda met Fred Rogers in 1966. She had graduated from Carnegie Mellon. She was trying to decide what she wanted to do. She went to WQED to see if she could volunteer. And they told her they didn't have any children's programs, but there's this guy, Fred Rogers, she should talk to him. Hedda went to talk to Fred Rogers, had a conversation. Fred said, I think you should go program in child development at the University of Pittsburgh and study child development. 2 years later, when Fred was starting to produce Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he called Hedda and said, would you come in and volunteer with us? And Hedda worked with Fred and is still to this day working with a company at that time was called Family Communications, now Fred Rogers Production. Over 50 years. Freda.
Yeah, all right, that's okay.
Still coming out. Freda. Hedda was a very, very close advisor to Fred and to the work that he did. When Fred died and they were going to start the Fred Rogers Institute at St. Vincent College, they called and asked Hedda to work on the development of that program. She did and did such a magnificent job, and the college was so impressed with what she did, they gave her an honorary degree. She still works with the Institute and still works with Fred Rogers Productions. She is now a script advisor for Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which I must say is the most popular children's program on PBS. But what I am very impressed with is that Hedda is a storyteller and a magnificent storyteller. When she talks about young children, to people who work with children, it's all about the stories that she has heard in working with teachers and early childhood people. And tonight, we get to hear her own story. As I was sitting there and the screen came up, and it says, Our Family Story. One of the things I always say about Fred Rogers, he never used a personal pronoun. It's not Hedda's story, it's our family story. And I am grateful that Hedda took the time to write it for her children and grandchildren, and will share it with us tonight. Hedda?
I'm okay with this. You're a hard act to follow, Mr. Eisler.
I'm glad I'm speaking before you.
I need to what? Oh, I will. Oh, okay. The one from here? Is it the one from here that I should use that Bill had? Can you hear me now? Yes. Will you forgive me if I say it's a beautiful night in this neighborhood? Old friends, new friends. This is very touching for me, and I'm truly honored. One of the gifts of working with a television series is that you work with the scripts for a season, and then the season moves it over to either the television studio or the animation studio. And you can sit quietly for a couple of months until the next season rolls around. Well, that's what happened to me last summer. I wonder if some of you are in the same situation that I've been in, that, we have all these notes, conversations that people had with my parents and with my grandparents. We had cassettes, some of them in Yiddish, some of them in English, of different cousins who were curious and did that. We have photos, and I said, I have to put it together. We have to make a story for the next generation. This can't get just lost after us. And so I was really grateful when I came to Emily and Christina, and I said, I need some help with this. And they said, let's tell the story, Hedda. Let's tell the story here. And you know that this is going to end up as some sort of story that will be part of the Holocaust Center here in Pittsburgh. I wanted to give you some context for this. And so I'm going to start with telling you about, some of you knew my parents. Let's see, we'll go with this one here. Some of you knew my family, our family, as Bill said. My father, Oliver Sholem, he died in 1977. My mother, Oliver Sholem, died in 2003. That's me, and that's my sister, Rena Havison. I don't know if some of you knew the Havisons. My sister is in Seattle. We grew up in McKeesport. How many of you know where McKeesport is? Yes, good old McKeesport. It was a wonderful Jewish community to grow up in. But my sister and I used to say that we grew up with 1 foot in McKeesport and 1 foot in Lithuania, because our family was really rooted in Lithuania. It took me a while to figure out, we've been saying Lithuania for a long time, and then I said, wait, let me see where Lithuania is. And so I thought I'd bring you this map so that you can share with me where these places are. But what's interesting about my family story is that my grandmother and her husband, Ethel Strauss and Joseph Strauss, came to America in 1905. But you know what? They went back. They had children, they lived here, and they went back. Some of you may know other families who went back. You know why? Because they were in Pittsburgh. My grandfather worked in Pittsburgh, and the industrial air was so beastly then that he was developing asthma and all kinds of rashes and difficulties breathing. And so here's this family that came to America that after 5 years and took their children, and everybody went back to Lithuania to try to get my grandfather to recover. Here, that's Joseph Strauss, and that's my grandmother. They had a lumber yard in Lithuania. It was along the river. So there they were. My grandfather was recuperating, and here's the story. My grandmother said, I don't want to live here in Lithuania. I really think we ought to get back to America. You go back, you earn some money, and find a way for us to come. So my grandfather, on his own, this Joseph Strauss, went back to Pittsburgh, and he worked in the Hill District. He worked as a janitor in one of the hospitals. And my grandmother was left alone. She was left alone with her children, waiting for him. But then, of course, what happened in 1911, the war broke out. And I'll just take you back here. When the war broke out, the Lithuanians deported the Jews because they were afraid that because they spoke German, that they would be spies on the Germans. And so they deported them all the way into this was Russia at that time. And so they came to the Sea of Azov, and they lived there as refugees, hardly eating anything. I mean, maybe some of you would know the song that we used to sing, Zontig Bovis, Montig Bovis. Do you know this one? The Yiddish song, Sunday potatoes, Monday potatoes, Tuesday potatoes, Wednesday potatoes, and then Friday was a kugela, or Shabbos was a kugela from potatoes. But that's what they lived on, meager foods. It was about 5 years till World War I ended, and then came the Russian Revolution, so they still couldn't leave from there. It took them about 5 or 6 years, but then they came back to Vilna. They came back. Now, this is the family in Vilna. This is my mother here. And this is her sister, who was married to Abrasha, who's at the end. That's Joseph and Ethel, and that's my Uncle Morris, and not one of the uncles. And they settled there. Okay, my mother then there were 3 main Jewish cities in Lithuania. There was Vilna, there was Kovna, and there was Shavel up there. My mother was able to go, the family drifted over to Kovna, And my mother went to the high school there. She went to the Hebrew gymnasium. All the languages, all the courses were taught in Hebrew. But you know what? It was a biblical Hebrew. There wasn't an Israeli modern day Hebrew. And my father also. My father, who was from Shavel, Kovna, and was also, there's my father. You'll excuse, this is a funny screen here with the squares in it. But that's my father here. His father was a grain merchant, and they had the horse and buggies that they were using to deliver the grains from the farmers to the market. My mother went to, she decided that after high school, that she would go to beauty school and become a beautician. And my father was going to the university, and he was studying chemical engineering. See, I'm so used to talking about Fred Rogers that just comes naturally off. This is so new to me, to be talking about my parents. My parents met at a New Year's Eve party. My mother went with one date, and she fell in love with my father, and this poor lucky date she had to leave alone because she left with my father. And my parents started courting. Here in Scripstava, here's another picture. And then they decided in 1936, my father was about to be conscripted into the army, the Lithuanian army, and he sure didn't want that. And so he and my mother decided, let's get married. And it was interesting. They said, let's get married, and either we go to Israel or we go to America. I remember hearing them talk about this. And I remember my father saying, if we go to America, we can make enough money so that then we can go to Israel someday. We can afford it. And in fact, they did go to Israel a couple of times. They were ardent Zionists when they were growing up. So my parents got married. We have a picture of the wedding. So this is 1935, 36. Now my mother was an American citizen. She had been born here in those early years. And so she said, I'll go back to America. And she had to show that she could support him. And he said, okay, I'll come follow you. And so they came to America. What's interesting is they left behind a couple people. They left behind my father's father. He was an old man. He was a widower. There were no other siblings. He said, I'm happy here. I'll stay. You can go. Go make a good life for yourself. My mother's sister, Freda, and her husband, Abrasha, the ones who were on that other picture, they said, yeah, we'll stay too. Things are good here. We're fine. And you know what happened? The war broke out, and everybody lost track of who was back there in Lithuania. They came here, and this was interesting to us. My mother had a beauty salon in McKeesport, the modern beauty salon. They decided they would buy a salon, my parents. But I never knew this until I read through some of the papers, letters that my father sent. My father worked in the beauty salon he was a chemistry major at the university. And so what he was making was shampoos and a permanent wave solution, remember that stuff, and gels. And he actually kind of set up a business of selling some of those to other beauty salons. But you know then what happened. The war broke out, and my father enlisted in the army. It's kind of interesting. My father didn't say much about his army experience. We knew he was in the intelligence division, but it was only about last summer when a cousin said to me, you know what, I bet he was one of the Ritchie boys. Do you know the Ritchie boys? Well, I decided to do some research about it. And I wrote to the Army archives and said, was he indeed? And here's what I found. This was the document. You see, he entered Camp Ritchie, Maryland, February 18th, 1943. I didn't know anything about Camp Ritchie. Maybe some of you have not heard of this. Camp Ritchie, it was set up in Hagerstown, Maryland, but not at the beginning of the war, because they were worried at the beginning of the war, the Americans were worried, if we let the immigrants who knew German and Russian, if we let them in here, they're going to be spies and this is not a good situation. But one of the high command people thought, you know what? These immigrants could really help us because they know the language and they know the terrain, a lot of them. So what they did, they set up an 8-week intensive place for them to train in Hagerstown, Maryland. Now, I have to tell you something funny about this. I was really curious about what the Ritchie Boys was. I mean, one thing I did, and if you're interested in this, there is a great 60-minute YouTube about the Ritchie Boys. And one of the things that I saw there was one of the Ritchie Boys said, we did interrogation of the prisoners of World War II. But he said, we did not use force. We were not to use force. We were not to use violence. What we were to use was complicity. And it's almost like, for example, we're going to say, if you don't tell me where your troops are heading, you know who's going to get you, the Russians, and they're going to be even harder on you. So it's very interesting to think of that in terms of interrogation. But they set up this incredible training camp where not only did they even brought in actors, and they brought in to work with the interrogators to help them know how to do this best. They trained in communication in Morse code and carrier pigeons. And in terrain, they would drop them off in the middle of, Hagerstown, Maryland is the middle of nowhere, and they would drop the soldiers off and have them find their way home so that they would learn about how you find your way through. They had to memorize things like uniforms and tanks and things so that they would know what they were dealing with. And the kicker to me, and I'm going to donate this book to the Holocaust Museum. The kicker to me was there's a story, a part in there that said that the men, while they were there at Hagerstown, they needed some kind of social life. So some of them went to the Lions Club and those kind of things, and they met women, had dances and parties. But where did the Jewish guys go? Honest to goodness. They went to Camp Louise, which was the JCC camp from Baltimore, Maryland, that I was a counselor at and after my freshman year at college. Well, there you are. There you are. So that's the kind of training that my father had. And I have a note here that in 2022, the U.S. Holocaust Museum named the Ritchie Boys the highest honor of the Elie Wiesel Award for their remarkable actions and heroism in helping to end the war and the Holocaust. Okay, so now we come to my family's Holocaust story. The war ended, and my father was in Poissy, France. He was near Paris. And one day, a friend of his who was a reporter, he had been a reporter in Lithuania and had left Lithuania and gone to England, and he was a journalist. He happened to come into my father's army base they were friends, he and my father, and he said, I was just in Dachau. This was the war had ended. He said, I was just in Dachau, and there are some people from your hometown there. So my father asked his army commander if he could borrow a Jeep and a driver and go and see if he could help some of these people, see who was there. I will tell you, he never thought there was any chance that his father might have been alive, because he knew the story that those over 50 went here and those under 50 went to work in the labor camps. Never, and he also thought that my mother's sister would have been alive, Freda and Nebraska. They were the under 50. Surely they would have been alive. All right, so my father came with the Jeep, and he came into the grounds of what was Feldefink, which was right near Dachau, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. And a group of men started to crowd around him. There's my father. This American soldier here. What is this? What is this? And one of the men called out, Heimke, komm, dein Papa ist da. Charles, come, your father is here. And they didn't know where. They had just been displaced into this barracks of the administration building in Feldefink, and they started walking with my father, and they crowded him. My father described the scene. I ran up the steps, and the stench hit me in the face. I couldn't imagine anyone could live in a place like this. I opened the door, and I found 2 broken down men eating out of one plate. And in a daze, my grandfather asked, is it day or is it night? Are we dead or alive? My father wrote, in a minute, the room was filled with people, and they all wanted to touch me. They thought I was sent by God. And to his nephew, who was the other broken down man sharing the plate with him, to his nephew, my papa said, I told you, if Charles is in the army, he will find us. I have here the photo. That's my father, and that's my grandfather, Papa. And this is Heimendel Furman. I'll tell you a little bit about somebody in the audience today who is related to Heimendel Furman. That was his nephew. And here, my father, we have tons of these photos, and I look on the back, and my father's handwriting, he wrote, I am with a group of youth friends and schoolmates from Schavel. The picture taken on June 9th, 1945 in Freeman. The fellow with the mustache, black coat, and German soldier's cap on the extreme right facing is Joseph Silberman, the one who saw me first at Camp Freeman and hollered, Heimke, dein Papa ist da, komm. That we have this in his handwriting. Now, my grandfather had survived. How had he survived? Because he lied about his age. And he was a schwer Arbeiter. Arbeit macht frei. That was my grandfather. So then the question was, what happened to my mother's sister, Freda, and her husband, Abrasha? It turned out that when the Nazis came to the ghetto and said those over 50 here and those under 50 there, this couple did not want to leave his parents, and they went with the over 50. and they were massacred. Okay, so how did Papa get to Feldafing, where my father had found him? In April of 1945, the Nazis felt the war might be over soon, so they forced the Jewish camp laborers from Dachau who had survived. They forced them on a death march across the Alps. I have notes here from my father and grandfather. It was the 27th day of April, and the Nazis took us to the Alps to shoot us because it was overcrowded in the ovens. They could gas only 2,000 a day. So they took us with Ukrainian guards with dogs and took them in the night on back roads near Dachau and Munich, never on the main highway so people wouldn't see them. The dogs kept us in line. On the third night, the snow was falling and we all laid down exhausted and fell asleep. In the morning, Chaimendel, my grandfather's nephew, woke up in 4 inches of snow. Everyone was covered with snow. We couldn't see anyone because they were all covered with snow. We couldn't see the guards. Where were the guards? The guards had heard the American tanks and they fled. About a half hour later, the American tanks passed by and they threw sea rations of marmalade boxes and crackers. Chaimendel caught some, gave them to my grandfather. Some kind farmers told them to go to their barn and gave them potatoes. And later in the day, the American soldiers helped them go back to a better place. They put the captured Nazis into the concentration camp and the surviving refugees into the administrative building in Feldafing. And the Germans surrendered on May 8th. My papa had been in Feldafing almost 2 months before my father found him in June of 1945. So then it's kind of interesting. What happened then is, what do you do now that you found them? There were 3 people that my father took with him back to the army base. My grandfather, his nephew Chaimendel, and the third one was Dr. Segel. And my father found a way to help him get to Israel, where his wife was. But this is interesting. My father went to the mayor of the town and said, I need clothes for 3 men. And I need it in 2 hours because I have to get back to my army base. And the mayor said, I can't do that. And my father, this is the story my father used to say. He said, I said to him, whatever happened to Germans' Pünktlichkeit, the Germans' efficiency? And embarrassed, the guy got it. And then they were deloused. And then they came to the army base. And the commander of the army base said to my father, they will eat what we eat and they will sleep where we sleep. My grandfather, for a couple of months till he got strong enough, he was 170 pounds when my father had last seen him. He was down to 95, and he needed the strength. He worked here with my father doing some gardening at the army base. And then my father had to work to get him to America. So my father went to the French consulate, and my mother went on the train from McKeesport to Washington, D.C. to talk with the senator. And they came to America. This was from the New York Daily News. It says, liberated by his son, a U.S. Army captain, one of the first survivors of the horrible Nazi concentration camp at Dachau was in this country today, a broken man who could only sit and stare and murmur dazedly, why did this all have to happen? What did we do to deserve it? Israel Bluestone, 59, and a nephew, Chaim Furman, 38, who shared his experiences as a Nazi slave laborer. arrived here Friday on the freighter, Marie Mitchell. Here we had, let's see, there was we have the document from Hayas of when they arrived. And my grandfather lived with us. I'll tell you a funny thing. In McKeesport, we had only 3 bedrooms. So my parents lived in the master bedroom, and I slept in the room with Grandma, and Rena had to sleep in the room with Papa. And Rena and I really wanted to be able to share a bedroom, and it took us a long while to figure out why we couldn't, because it was my mother's mother and my father's father. And it was a Yiddish-speaking home. My grandparents spoke no English. And my grandfather was very religious. He would daven after every meal. And I remember, my sister talks about this too, as we were cleaning off the table after dinner, and he was davening, and he would go, and we would point to the crumbs that we had left there and hadn't moved. There he is in a white kittel in Passover. We're heading to Passover next week, and it's never the same. It's those Seders, when my father and my grandfather was, and I mean, they weren't just na-na-na-na, I mean, they were doing the words. And we kept kosher. He was very deliberate about Shabbos and walking. Even when the shul closed us in McKeesport, he walked pretty far to get to the Orthodox shul in White Oak. He made a sukkot in the backyard, a sukkah. He did it with 3 doors. He wove them together, wove the hinges together, and the ears of corn, the corn stalks on the top. And I'll tell you something else, and it's interesting that I see Joel Siegel here today. Joel's father, Dave Siegel, my father, when he came out of the Army, this is another little funny story, he was a chemical engineer, and his buddy in the Army said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to make a factory, and we're going to make plastic silverware. And my father said, oh, come on, no one's going to eat from plastic silverware. So, and then my father ended up going into the scrap business. David Siegel, Joel's father, was the manager in the warehouse, the foreman. And my grandfather, after all that slave labor in Dachau, my grandfather worked in the yard. Joel, tell us. He worked with him. He was a hard worker. And I think, he also kept his eye on all the other guys there so he could report to my father. But he was a schwer arbiter. And the wonderful thing is that he lived long enough to be a great-grandfather. There's my father and me, my first child, Amy, and my grandfather. In there. This was a kind, loving man after all that he had been through. The story, it's a story. To us it's a story, but this is what he lived through. And I thank you for coming here to hear it. And, we need to be grateful for the moments that we have of goodness. Thank you.
Do you want to introduce Erin before we do Q&A? Erin, do you want to introduce Erin before Q&A?
Yes, this is my cousin Erin. Come on, stand up, Erin. Erin Furman's uncle was Chaim Mendel. And Aaron and his family stayed in Feldafink for a while. His mother and father both lost their spouses and children in the camp, in the concentration camp. And Aaron, where were you born?
I was born in Feldafing.
He was born.
Now, I was in the Army in 1968, and I was stationed in Heidelberg. And we went to Munich for our Oktoberfest, and Feldafing's about maybe 20 miles from there. And I went to visit there. I remember Hedda's grandfather coming to our house all the time. He would walk over to our house, sit in our kitchen table, and stuff like that. Hedda's mom and dad took care of my mother and father. My mother saw Nazis behind every couch. I have a picture of my mother that I showed Hedda a couple weeks ago, and she was young. I don't know that woman. She was with a friend of hers. Maybe 2 weeks later, the Germans came. I have no idea because I don't know this. I really don't know the young mother that I was. But Hedda's mom and dad knew. I mean, they just knew what was going on in my mother's head, or even I didn't know what was going on in my mother's head. You know, it took me a long time to come to the realization. And I just want to say, what happened then with the Nazis can happen today. I see it every day on the news. I saw it 10 years ago, started, little by little. And don't ever think that it can't happen, because it can.
Well, thank you. Yeah. My parents brought his mother and father from New York, brought him to McKeesport, and gave his father a job at the Temple B'nai Israel in McKeesport. And I mean, we all helped each other.
So if anyone has any questions, I can run microphones out.
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. The question that I have is that you mentioned I'm going to say the Ritchie boys, and they had to memorize equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Whose equipment were they memorizing?
The Germans and the Russians, and also then they had to bring in people who could understand the Japanese equipment later in the war.
Hedda, as a fellow child of survivors, I just want to thank you for telling the story. Every story is so much different than the next. So many miracles, so many coincidences, et cetera, et cetera. Did all the documents that you have, well, first of all, not this one, but the black and white pictures, yours are way better than mine. They're so clear.
It's called PhotoMine.
Oh, okay.
PHOTOMYNE.
Okay. But the documents and the letters and everything, did you know about them, or did you find them after your father passed away?
We knew about them, but they were just like sacred things that were there, that were part of their world. We knew the story, of course. And my sister took, there were a ton of onion skin papers of the letters, the copies. He wrote, my father, after the war, worked so hard writing letters to people saying, it's cold, that your aunt is here and she needs clothing. Can you send clothing? Or does anyone know where my sister put this book together of all the letters. These are all the letters that my father had written to try to help other people, try to help them find connections with relatives. Yeah, it's funny. This stuff sits there and you say, one day I'm going to get to it. And I figured last summer I had the time. But I still need somebody who I can speak Yiddish and I can sing good Yiddish, but I can't read it, the cursive. So if anybody can help me, because I have a lot of photos with the...
Have you tried the Yiddish Book Center in Boston?
I am connected with them because I sent my parents books there. And but that's a good thought. I thought maybe there's somebody here. You know who I used to use? Avi Monroe's father. used to help me with the Yiddish.
Or you can put it on the Jewish Pittsburgh Facebook page too.
Good, thank you.
We have someone, she's just still in Florida.
Right. Yeah.
Is there?
Yeah, I was curious, with your dad, about to be conscripted in 1936 and a decision to come visit that time. Obviously, the growing problems in Germany, the eventually Nuremberg laws, all that stuff that was happening in the 30s. Nobody knew that it was going to spread to other parts of Europe, all that stuff. But was there any discussion in your family about just worry about that playing into any of their decision making?
I don't know, but I'll bet it was. Those were starting to get very difficult times there. It was 1936, 37. So obviously, yeah. But what I understand, the main point was he did not want to be conscripted into the army. And he had finished the university and you saw them, they're in love. Let's get married and let's go to America and see what we can do. You just wish that we had asked more. I have, different relatives. I have these different, kinds of conversations that we had. Everybody wrote notes. And that's the kind of thing we just have to keep asking the questions. It's interesting. I'll give you a Fred Rogers quote. Our questions are more important than our answers. But I know this population is not going to be around us very much, and we've got to keep it in their words as much as we can too.
This is not a question, but it's a comment. My family is from Sharapan, same city, and I have a cousin. We all scattered between South Africa, England, and America, and my cousin in Canada now, and we're old, we're in our 80s. Recently went back to Sharapan and researched the family and the Jewish population. And they talked to many people who lived there. And they were told that before the Germans actually got to Sharapan, any Jew that was left was collected, taken to the forest and killed.
Yep.
By the Lithuanians.
Yep.
Before the Nazis even got
That's right.
There were no Jewish people left in that area.
Right. And it's interesting, we had asked my mother, do you ever want to go back? No. Mm-mm.
None of us want to go back.
No.
But they researched it.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Michelle. My parents are both survivors, one from Germany and one from Vienna. My question is, when did you start hearing stories, and how did your listening and understanding evolve as you got older?
That's a very interesting question, especially since I have a background in child development. We heard it, I would say, we heard these stories from day one. My parents often had visitors who came and told their stories. And the story, I'm going to tell you one that just blew our minds. It was a family that had a little boy, a son. And they were living in the ghetto, but every now and then the Nazis would come and raid. And so they would hide the boy in the attic. But when they got to the point that they felt they couldn't hide him any longer, the father in the family had a brother who was dating a Gentile girl. And he went to her and said, could you help us? If we give you the boy, will you hold him until the war is over? And she finally agreed. And they took the boy. It was interesting. I heard that they see all these details you hear when they took him in a wagon and covered him over, of course, with blankets, And the doctor had told them, a doctor friend had told them, don't give him any kind of tranquilizer, because if he wakes up, he'll be just too startled. He won't know where he is. Just help him know to be quiet. So he went and lived with this woman. All right, so now the war is over. The father said, he said, after the war, there was a resort town nearby. I'll come get him there. All right, so now the war is over. The mother died in the camp, and the father made the trip back to the resort and thought, okay, I'll take my son. And she said, you can't have him. He's mine. You can't have him. And he said, I stayed there for a couple of months with them. I thought maybe I can convince her to bond with me. And he said, so I decided one night, it was her birthday, and I got a bottle of wine, and I got her drunk, and I was drunk, and I said, will you marry me? And they married. And he said it was actually a pretty good marriage, because I needed her, and she needed me. I needed the son. That we heard those stories constantly. And it became, part of the lore. And I don't know, you take it in, and I realize I was born in 1944, could have been me. Could have been me. In fact, Bill, you might appreciate this. We had a group from Germany who wanted to talk about international programming. And I remember we met in Oregon for this retreat. And we were standing on the balcony, this fellow and I, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and he said, you could have marched in front of me and I could have pointed the gun at you. That doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think your family experience of surviving the Holocaust influenced your career of working with children and with Mr. Rogers?
Oh, that's very interesting. I never thought about that, Emily. I don't know. I think it's something about goodness. I used to do BBG tournaments. I used to do the Diary of Anne Frank as part of the convention, the competitions. And I think all of that must come together in some way to make us know how precious life is, how precious childhood is. That it's a tough world, and to understand the goodness. I'll just tell you this, I've started, even lately, instead of saying to people, a happy holiday or happy birthday or I hope you have a happy vacation, I'm saying, I hope you have good moments in your day. I hope you have good moments in your year, in your week. But you know what? There are good moments. You walk around and look for the little flowers on the ground. Look for the smiles at people. That was Fred Rogers. We can find a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Did you ever meet anybody else from the Ritchie
No.
group? No.
I was astounded. I had no idea my father was in that category of counterintelligence, but it was fascinating to read and to learn about. And quite wise of the government to say, let's do this intensive training and take advantage of what we have here. I think out of 20,000 of them, 2,000 they said were refugees that we could really help in this effort.
We went to a program last week in Youngstown, Ohio, and there was a professor from West Point who did a program on the Ritchie, everything. So you talking about, it's like, wow.
Yeah, it was actually not discussed as, quote, the Ritchie boys until somebody made a documentary, someone in Germany in 2004. Yeah. But it's worth reading about and understanding.
Before I ask the question, when you said about West Point, what's the name, Emily, the gentleman who spoke from West Point, what's the name of their Holocaust? They have a whole center at West Point, and they teach the.
Oh, really?
Oh my God, it's incredible, and this man spoke about it. Anyway, my question is.
That's who it was.
Yeah, he was amazing. My question is, did any of your family share any of the anti-Semitism when they were in Europe?
No. I think they had pretty good lives before they came here. I don't think they experienced it.
I have a quick question. What did you write to get that amazing army record? Because my dad came from Vienna and came at 12, finished high school at the Bronx High School of Science in New York. And I found a Yale acceptance letter in his folder because I've had my own service, but he enlisted. And I don't know if they knew that Austrians spoke German. My mother thinks that Austrians don't speak German.
Right.
And he was a private and went to northern Italy. And then when he kept getting sick because he was billeted at a farm and was allergic to many animals, he was in the hospital and he probably got a letter in German. I have to figure this all out. And he got in trouble. Why are you getting a letter in German? And then they figured out he was German and he went into the OSS. But I really, that is all hypothesis and story that I just got. I'll be upfront. Where did you get that? Amazing.
God bless the internet. I searched Ritchie boys, and I have here the letter that I wrote to them. It's something with the Army Archives. There is another way that they charge money for some of it, but this was free. But you have the information too?
Yeah, Michelle, I'll let you know, but after I learned this, I had the same question about my grandfather. There's a government agency. I know, Hedda was like, you should check. So there's a number you can call. You had a question.
Did you ever wonder how your parents got to have such joy and happiness with their history?
Well, that's a good question. And the question of my grandfather, how you come out of that, loving kindness, and finding joy. I don't know if it's in some people's DNA. And I had heard stories of some people who just kind of gave up, even in the concentration camps, and they couldn't handle it. I guess that's what it is. But I know they were all so grateful. My father stayed in the Army Reserves till he was 60 years old. Wow. And I remember him so proudly walking out the front door in his uniform on Monday nights to go to his Army Reserve meetings. They were so grateful to be here in America and to be able to live the life that they had, and to associate with some wonderful other people, and the Jewish community in McKeesport was wonderful too. It was a community.
You know, I just got one more statement here. Just go.
Okay, I'll come back. Hi, Ellie.
Hi, Ellie. Oh, you. Hello.
So good to talk to you last week and tell me about this. So I'm curious, your dad didn't want to be conscripted in the Lithuanian army. Was he drafted, or did he sign up for the U.S. Army, and what changed What made him say yes in 12?
I suppose that's a good question, because it sort of reminds me of the question you had before. Did they experience anti-Semitism? Maybe his sense was that the Lithuanian army was not going to be very open to Jews, and he did not want to be a part of that. And America was, the bright shining light over there. And once he came to America in 1937 and really got established with my mother in the beauty salon, making permanent wave solution and shampoos. And it was only, I think it was 1941 when he enlisted in the army. So it was a whole different reason of wanting to be a part of the army. The American army, he really wanted to fight for. He wanted to fight for the goodness of the world.
This goes to the human spirit, and I don't know if you told me or your mom told me that when your dad found his father and they were sitting in the dining room, your father looks at him and says, "Come and sit down, my son, you must be tired." And that story always makes me cry after all this person has gone through. His son must be tired.
I deliberately did not tell that sentence because I thought nobody will believe it. That he said to my father, the strong American army soldier, "Sit down, my son, you must be tired."
That says it all about him, truly.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you. Many stories, many lives.
We'll do one more, and then Shirley can hang around and.
Sure.
Hi, I don't know if you would know this, but does anyone have any idea about what percentage of the American military were made up of European immigrants? Because, for World War II, because they clearly would have been able to speak many languages, a lot more than just Americans, unless, they were brought up with immigrant parents. Because I would think that would be something that the Army would want, or the other factors in the military would want.
Actually, what I read is at the beginning, the American Army did not want immigrants, certainly not immigrants who spoke German or Russian. But somebody said, you know what, this could be really a big help for us, and figured out a way to sift through and bring them on. And I think it's of the 20,000 at Camp Ritchie, 2,000 were refugees, immigrants.
In your specific question, I feel like it's too bad Barbara Bluestone just left, because she may be the one person in this audience who would know the answer, unless, does someone know that?
My question, Hedda, would be, do you have any letters that your father wrote back home? Because we've discovered, my grandmother, we buried her 3 years ago, but my grandfather was from, his family from Bohemia, Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic. And we found all these letters that his mother wrote in Bohemian to him and his brother Joe, who were both drafted. And so Uncle Joe liberated Pilsen, he was a tank commander, and my grandfather was a machinist, and he fixed tanks, so he was in northern Africa, France. But all these letters, the government read, and then the army went through them all, and she had the right to write if it was in Bohemian on it. And then they had translators read it to make sure they weren't passing secrets. So I'm curious, have you found any letters that your family would have sent, and anything like that?
It seemed to me what my sister and I found were letters that were written in English between my mother and my father. But that's a very interesting question. My father was in the field of communication. in counterintelligence. So he was probably one of the people looking at letters like that and saying, I don't know, I don't know.
They were blocked out, and some were, they would take pictures of them and then send the picture to the family or to my grandpa. He saved all the ones he received and corresponded between his siblings were all in English, but his mother was all in English.
Yeah, interesting. Hold on to those pieces, hold on. I will tell you something interesting. This cousin of mine, the one who talked about the Ritchie boys, he was sitting with me and going through some of these old documents, and he showed me on the iPad, there is a site that will translate written documents, and even Lithuanian. You hold it over the document and it tells you what it says in English. I guess it was Google, I don't know, yeah, Google Translator. He said, yeah, it's right here. So we do have technology that can help.
Well, thanks so much.
Around if anyone has questions. We have some books and things at the back table. If anyone, I should have said this at the beginning, but there are bathrooms around the back if you need. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Hedda, for sharing your family story.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.